Linda Wallace had always envisioned her new suburban home as a sanctuary. After spending years as a legal analyst dissecting high-stakes cases in the city, she longed for peace and quiet. Her decision to leave behind the chaos of courtrooms and endless deadlines felt like the first breath of fresh air she'd taken in years. The house she purchased, a charming two-story home with a sprawling backyard, seemed like the perfect retreat. The yard was her favorite part, a well-maintained lawn, a few fruit trees, and a small garden she had carefully nurtured since moving in 6 months ago. Linda loved starting her mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. One late spring morning, however, that peaceful rhythm was shattered. Linda woke to the sound of machinery, sharp metallic clanking, and a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. At first, she thought it might be construction on the main road a few blocks away. But as the noise grew louder, she realized it was much closer than that. Curious and increasingly annoyed, she threw on a light jacket and stepped out onto her back porch. What she saw made her stop mid-step. A team of workers was busy in her backyard. Men in neon vests and hard hats moved with practiced efficiency, unloading long metal beams and laying what appeared to be narrow railroad tracks. A small bulldozer was already carving into her neatly trimmed lawn, tearing a trench that extended across her property line. Her garden beds, once a source of pride, were now a mess of uprooted flowers and displaced soil. Linda stood frozen for a moment, her brain struggling to process what she was seeing. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. One of the workers glanced up briefly but said nothing, returning to his task of hammering a support beam into the ground. Linda marched toward the scene, anger and confusion bubbling to the surface. "Hey! What the hell's going on here? This is private property!" It was then that a familiar figure stepped into view. Her neighbor, Ray Gibson. A tall man in his late 40s, Ray always carried himself with an air of casual arrogance. He lived 2 doors down and had a reputation for being the kind of neighbor who offered unsolicited advice and treated the street like his personal domain. Linda hadn't had much interaction with him aside from a brief introduction when she moved in, but something about his demeanor had always rubbed her the wrong way. "Good morning, Linda," Ray called out, his tone far too cheerful given the circumstances. He approached her with a clipboard in hand, as if this were a routine neighborhood meeting. "I was wondering when you'd come out to see this. Isn't it exciting?" Linda stared at him, incredulous. "Exciting? What are you talking about? What is all of this? And why are these people on my property?" Ray gave her a patronizing smile, the kind that made her feel as if she were the one being unreasonable. "It's a community project," he explained. "I've been working on this for months. We're installing a miniature railway system to connect the neighborhood. It's going to be revolutionary, a game changer for property values and community spirit. Trust me, you're going to love it." Linda blinked at him, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Ray, I didn't agree to anything like this. You can't just come onto my property and start digging up my yard." "Technically, I can," Ray replied, his tone maddeningly calm. He held up the clipboard, which contained a stack of papers she couldn't make out from where she stood. "I've got the permits right here. Everything's above board. Plus, I spoke to several of the neighbors, and they were all on board with the idea. It's going to be a huge benefit for everyone." "Several of the neighbors?" Linda repeated, her voice rising. "Did it ever occur to you to ask me? The person whose yard you're tearing apart?" Ray shrugged. "I figured once you saw the plans, you'd understand. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, you know?" Linda felt a surge of anger unlike anything she'd felt in years. She stepped closer, pointing toward the tracks that now cut through her lawn. "You need to stop this immediately. I don't care what kind of permits you think you have. This is my property, and I didn't authorize any of it." Ray's smile faded slightly, but his confidence remained intact. "Linda, I understand you're upset. Change is hard, but I assure you, this is all perfectly legal. You're the only one on the street who seems to have an issue with it." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Ray turned and walked away, shouting instructions to the workers. "Let's keep it moving, guys. We're on a tight schedule." She stood there for a moment, watching as the workers ignored her presence entirely, continuing to hammer, dig, and drill. Her chest tightened with frustration. This couldn't be happening. It felt surreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. She stormed back into the house, her hands trembling as she grabbed her phone. She didn't know what to do first. Call the police, a lawyer, or perhaps both. What she did know was that this was far from over. Linda sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone as if it might offer her a solution. The sound of construction continued outside, relentless and deafening, each hammer strike sending a pulse of irritation through her. She had never dealt with anything like this before, and, for the first time since moving into her house, she felt completely powerless. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the non-emergency police line, deciding that this was the logical first step. Surely, trespassing on someone's private property, even for a so-called community project, couldn't possibly be allowed. After a few minutes on hold, an officer finally answered. Linda did her best to remain calm as she explained the situation, outlining how a group of workers, hired by her neighbor, had invaded her yard and begun constructing a miniature railway without her consent. She emphasized that this was her private property, and that no one had contacted her or sought permission beforehand. The officer's response, however, was far from reassuring. "Ma'am, property disputes like this are typically considered civil matters. If you believe your rights are being violated, you may need to contact a lawyer and address it through the proper legal channels. We can only intervene if there's evidence of criminal activity, like vandalism or theft." Linda frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "So you're saying there's nothing you can do about them tearing up my lawn and digging trenches in my backyard?" The officer hesitated. "We can send someone out to take a look, but I can't guarantee it'll stop the construction. I recommend you gather any property documents you have, like a deed or a survey, and consult with an attorney as soon as possible." Disappointed but unwilling to give up, Linda agreed to have an officer come by and hung up. She immediately went to her office and pulled out the folder containing her property documents. As she flipped through the papers, she felt a surge of anxiety. What if Ray had found some obscure loophole to justify his actions? What if the so-called permits he waved around were somehow legitimate? The thought of being dragged into a lengthy legal battle made her stomach turn, but she knew she couldn't let this slide. About an hour later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of her house. Linda stepped outside to greet the officer, who introduced himself as Officer Daniels. He was a tall, no-nonsense man with a serious expression, and Linda felt a flicker of hope that he might be able to put a stop to this madness. As Linda led Officer Daniels into the backyard, Ray appeared, as if on cue. He strolled over with his usual smug demeanor, clipboard in hand, and greeted the officer with a friendly wave. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem here?" Daniels raised an eyebrow and looked between Linda and Ray. "I'm here responding to a complaint from Ms. Wallace. She says you're constructing something on her property without her permission." Ray nodded, completely unfazed. "That's correct. We're installing a miniature railway as part of a community improvement initiative. I have all the necessary permits and approvals right here." He held up the clipboard, offering it to the officer. Daniels took the clipboard and began flipping through the papers. Linda watched his face closely, trying to gauge his reaction. After a few moments, Daniels handed the clipboard back to Ray with a slight frown. "These permits are for construction within the community, but they don't specify this property. They're vague at best." Linda felt a spark of vindication. "So, does that mean he has to stop?" Daniels hesitated. "Ma'am, while these permits might not be specific to your property, determining whether or not this construction is legal is beyond my jurisdiction. I suggest you consult a lawyer and file a formal complaint. If this is a civil issue, it'll need to be resolved in court." Ray seized the moment, giving Linda a condescending smile. "See, Nothing to worry about? I'm sure this can all be sorted out amicably. Linda clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling over. Amicably? You've torn up my yard without asking? And you expect me to just roll over and let it happen? Ray shrugged. It's for the greater good, Linda. Once it's finished, you'll see how much value it adds to the neighborhood. Daniel stepped in, raising a hand to de-escalate the situation. Ms. Wallace, I suggest you gather all your documents and consult with legal counsel. Mr. Gibson, I'd advise you to tread carefully. If it turns out this construction is unauthorized, you could be held liable for damages. Ray's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. Understood, officer. Thank you for your time. As Daniels left, Linda felt a mixture of gratitude and despair. While the officer had been professional, his hands were clearly tied, and the responsibility of stopping this fell squarely on her shoulders. She returned inside, determined to find a lawyer who could help her fight back. Over the next few hours, Linda made dozens of calls, eventually connecting with a property lawyer named Jennifer Hayes. Jennifer listened intently as Linda explained the situation, asking detailed questions about the permits, the construction, and the interactions with Ray. After taking notes, Jennifer said, "From what you've described, this sounds like a clear violation of property rights. The permits he's showing off may not hold up under scrutiny. I'll need copies of your deed, any surveys you have, and photographs of the construction." Linda immediately sent Jennifer everything she had, along with a series of photos she had taken of the damage to her yard and the ongoing work. Jennifer promised to review the materials and get back to her with the next steps. That evening, Linda stepped outside to inspect the damage herself. The sight of her once pristine lawn now riddled with trenches and steel beams was heartbreaking. The workers had packed up for the day, leaving behind piles of equipment and debris. She noticed one of the ruts, cut alarmingly close to the foundation of her house, which raised even more concerns. What if this so-called railway project caused structural damage? As she walked back toward the house, something on her porch caught her eye. A plain white envelope tucked under the welcome mat. Frowning, Linda picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Your resistance is futile. Sell now or face the consequences." A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just about a railway anymore. It was personal. Someone wanted her out, and they were willing to intimidate her to make it happen. Clutching the note, Linda locked her doors and double-checked the windows, her mind racing with questions. Who had left the note? Was Ray behind this, or was someone else pulling the strings? The next morning, Jennifer called with her assessment. "Linda, I've reviewed everything you sent me, and you have a strong case. However, it's clear that this isn't just a misunderstanding. The note you received suggests that whoever's behind this is trying to bully you into selling. I'm going to file an injunction to stop the construction immediately, but we'll need to be prepared for pushback." Linda nodded, her resolve hardening. "Do whatever it takes. I'm not backing down." As she hung up the phone, Linda knew she was in for a fight. The tranquil life she had envisioned when she moved here was gone, replaced by a battle for her home and her peace of mind. But if Ray and whoever else was behind this thought she would cave under pressure, they were in for a rude awakening. Linda didn't sleep much after receiving the threatening note. Every creak in the house, every faint noise from the backyard, made her nerves tighten like a spring. The morning light brought little relief, but it did solidify her determination. She wasn't just fighting for her property anymore. This had become a battle for her safety, her dignity, and her sense of control. As the day wore on, she prepared herself for what she knew would be a long and grueling conflict. True to her word, Jennifer Hayes filed an emergency injunction early that morning to halt the construction. While the legal paperwork was being processed, Linda focused on documenting everything. She took more photographs of the damage to her yard, cataloged the equipment left behind by the workers, and began compiling a timeline of events. She knew the more evidence she had, the better her chances would be in court. Around mid-afternoon, Linda stepped outside to check the progress, or lack thereof, in her backyard. To her relief, The workers hadn't returned yet, though the half-finished tracks and piles of materials served as a glaring reminder of the intrusion. She was examining the trench nearest her house, trying to estimate how close it had come to her foundation, when she heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel behind her. Turning around, she saw Ray standing there, leaning casually against the wooden fence that separated their properties. "Afternoon, Linda," he said, his voice dripping with false amiability. "I see you're still upset." Linda crossed her arms, refusing to be baited. "What do you want, Ray?" "I just wanted to check in," he replied, feigning concern. "I heard you've been busy calling lawyers and filing complaints. I figured it'd be neighborly of me to offer a solution." "Neighborly?" Linda's voice sharpened. "You dug up my yard without permission, ignored every objection I've made, and now you're leaving threats on my doorstep. You don't get to play the concerned neighbor." Ray's expression darkened briefly before his mask of politeness snapped back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about with threats, but I'll tell you this. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. The railway is already halfway done, and once it's finished, you'll see the benefits. I'm trying to improve this neighborhood, Linda, not tear it apart." Linda took a step closer, her anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You don't get to decide what's good for this neighborhood, Ray. And you certainly don't get to destroy my property to do it." Ray sighed, as if she were a difficult child he had to reason with. "I'm trying to help you. If you'd just let this go, I could make things easier for you. Maybe even compensate you for the inconvenience. But if you keep pushing, you're only going to make things worse for yourself." "Is that a threat?" Linda shot back, her tone icy. Ray smirked. "It's advice." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Linda standing there, seething. She didn't need more proof that Ray was behind the note. His words practically confirmed it. But as infuriating as the encounter was, it also strengthened her resolve. Ray was trying to intimidate her into submission, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Later that evening, Jennifer called with an update. The injunction had been processed, which meant Ray and his workers were legally required to stop all construction until the matter could be resolved in court. Linda felt a brief surge of relief, but Jennifer's tone was cautious. Don't expect him to back down easily," Jennifer warned. "People like Ray tend to push boundaries. Be vigilant and keep documenting everything." Linda assured her she would and spent the rest of the night double-checking her locks and setting up makeshift barriers around the torn-up sections of her yard. She even placed motion sensor lights around the perimeter, hoping to deter any late-night trespassing. The knot of tension in her chest didn't ease, but she felt marginally more prepared. The next morning, Linda awoke to the sound of voices outside. For a moment, panic surged through her. Had the workers returned? She quickly threw on a jacket and ran to the back door. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. A group of neighbors had gathered along the fence, talking animatedly as they examined the unfinished tracks. Some gestured toward Linda's yard, while others spoke in hushed tones. One woman, whom Linda vaguely recognized from a block party, stepped forward when she noticed Linda watching. "Linda," the woman said, her tone a mix of concern and frustration, "we've been hearing about your disagreement with Ray. Is it true you're trying to stop the railway?" Linda hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. "Yes, it's true. He didn't ask for my permission before tearing up my yard. This isn't just a disagreement. He's trespassing. But he said this project would benefit all of us," another neighbor chimed in. "He told us it'd connect the community and raise property values. If you shut it down, aren't you hurting the whole neighborhood?" Linda's frustration flared. "Did any of you agree to let him dig up your yards? Or is it just mine?" The neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear they hadn't considered that aspect. Encouraged, Linda continued. "Ray isn't doing this for the community. He's doing it for himself. He's lied about permits, ignored property boundaries, and threatened me when I tried to stand up for my rights. If he's willing to do that to me, what makes you think he won't do it to the rest of you?" The group fell silent, some looking uncomfortable. Before anyone could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A white pickup truck pulled up to the curb, and two men stepped out, both dressed in work clothes. They carried surveying equipment and clipboards, their expressions unreadable. What's this now?" Linda muttered under her breath. One of the men approached her, offering a curt nod. "Ms. Wallace, we're here to conduct a property survey. Mr. Gibson requested it as part of the railway project." Linda's jaw tightened. "You're not setting foot on my property." The man held up his clipboard, his tone neutral but firm. "This is a public survey authorized by Mr. Gibson. We're within our rights to assess the property lines." Linda glared at him, her patience wearing thin. "If you think you can trespass on my property just because Ray told you to, you're mistaken. I have an injunction that halts all construction, and that includes surveys. If you try to set up here, I'll call the police." The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. After a moment, he turned back to his partner and muttered something. They loaded their equipment back into the truck and drove off, but Linda knew this wasn't the last she'd see of them. As the day wore on, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She caught glimpses of Ray loitering near the fence, his phone in hand, and she noticed the neighbors lingering longer than usual, whispering amongst themselves. It was clear that Ray was trying to turn them against her, framing her as the obstacle to their supposed progress. That night, as Linda sat in her living room, she heard a faint noise outside, a metallic clinking, followed by muffled voices. Her heart raced as she grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. In the dim light, she saw two figures near the tracks, crouched over what appeared to be a toolbox. Her stomach twisted with anger and fear. She quickly dialed Jennifer, explaining the situation. Jennifer's response was swift. "Call the police and report the trespassing. If they're violating the injunction, they'll be in serious legal trouble." Linda hung up and did exactly that. By the time the police arrived, the figures had disappeared, leaving only fresh tool marks and a sense of unease in their wake. It was a small victory, but Linda knew this fight was far from over. Ray wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, but neither was she. As the days passed, the tension between Linda and Ray continued to mount, spilling over into the neighborhood. The injunction had temporarily halted construction, but the scars on Linda's property remained. The half-finished railway tracks sat like an open wound in her backyard, and the sight of them each morning reignited her frustration. Though Ray's workers were gone for the time being, Linda felt far from victorious. Ray had not backed down, and his presence loomed over her life like a shadow. Her unease deepened when Jennifer, her lawyer, called with an update. "Linda, I've received word that Ray has filed a counterclaim," Jennifer said, her voice calm but serious. "He's arguing that your property is part of an old right-of-way easement that was never officially rescinded. He's trying to use that to justify the construction." Linda frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "A right-of-way easement? That's ridiculous. My property survey didn't show anything like that when I bought the house." "I agree," Jennifer replied. "But he's banking on the fact that most people wouldn't know how to refute a claim like this. He's trying to create enough confusion to force you into a settlement." Linda's frustration bubbled over. "He's just throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. What do we do now?" Jennifer sighed. "We'll need to challenge his claim directly. I'm going to dig into the property records and see if there's any merit to this easement argument. In the meantime, I need you to stay vigilant. If he's resorting to legal tricks, he might try other tactics to wear you down." Linda thanked Jennifer and hung up, but the conversation left her feeling drained. Ray was relentless, and his ability to manipulate the situation was unnerving. Determined not to let him gain the upper hand, Linda decided to dig into the history of her property herself. She spent hours combing through old documents and maps, trying to find any trace of the so-called easement. Despite her best efforts, she found nothing to suggest that Ray's claim had any basis in reality. Her search was interrupted that evening when a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found one of her neighbors, a wiry man in his 60s named George. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. "Evening, Linda," George said, his tone unusually guarded. "Mind if I come in?" Linda hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let him in. George was one of the few neighbors who hadn't taken sides in the conflict, and she wasn't sure what to expect from him. Once inside, he handed her the paper. "I thought you should see this," he said. "Ray's been passing these around the neighborhood." Linda unfolded the paper and felt her stomach drop. It was a flyer, printed with bold letters that read, "Community Project, blocked by selfish homeowner." Beneath the headline was a photo of Linda's house, along with a paragraph accusing her of sabotaging a project that would benefit everyone in the neighborhood. The flyer painted her as a troublemaker, someone who cared more about her personal comfort than the community. She stared at the paper, her anger rising with each word. "I can't believe this. He's trying to turn everyone against me." George nodded grimly. "It's working, too. A lot of folks are starting to think you're the bad guy in all this. Ray's got a way of making people believe whatever he wants." Linda clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had expected Ray to play dirty, but this was a new low. Not only was he trying to take her property, but now he was publicly smearing her reputation. "Thanks for showing me this, George," Linda said. "I appreciate it." George nodded, sipping his coffee. "I figured you deserved to know. Just watch your back, okay? Ray doesn't like to lose." After George left, Linda sat at her kitchen table, staring at the flyer. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. If Ray wanted to fight dirty, she would fight smarter. She decided to call Jennifer and update her on the latest development. "Jennifer, he's spreading lies about me now," Linda said as soon as her lawyer answered. "He's handing out flyers, turning the whole neighborhood against me." Jennifer's voice hardened. "That's harassment, Linda. We can use this as part of our case. I'll draft a cease and desist letter and send it to him immediately. Keep a copy of the flyer for your records." Linda thanked her and hung up, feeling a small spark of hope. If nothing else, Jennifer's support reassured her that she wasn't in this fight alone. The next morning, Linda woke to another unwelcome surprise. A sign had been planted at the edge of her property, near the unfinished tracks. It read, "Community Railway, coming soon." The bold letters were accompanied by a cartoonish drawing of a smiling train. Linda's jaw tightened as she marched outside, yanking the sign out of the ground. She threw it onto her porch and took a photo of it to send to Jennifer. Before she could go back inside, Ray appeared, walking toward her with his usual smug expression. "Morning, Linda," he called out. "Saw you found the sign. Looks good, doesn't it?" Linda crossed her arms, glaring at him. "It's trespassing, just like everything else you've done." Ray chuckled. "You've got quite the temper. You know, if you weren't so stubborn, we wouldn't have to go through all this." "You're the one causing all of this," Linda shot back. "You're trying to bully me into giving up my property, but it's not going to work." Ray's smirk faded slightly, and for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Always playing the victim. Well, let me tell you something, Linda. You're out of your depth here. This isn't just about you." Before she could respond, Ray turned and walked away, leaving her seething. His parting words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. What did he mean by, "This isn't just about you"? That night, Linda decided to expand her surveillance efforts. She installed additional motion-activated cameras around her property, ensuring that every corner of her yard was covered. If Ray or his workers tried anything else, she would have undeniable proof. Her precautions paid off sooner than she expected. Around midnight, the cameras captured footage of two men sneaking onto her property. They carried tools and appeared to be tampering with the tracks near the trench closest to her house. Linda watched the live feed from her phone, her heart pounding. She quickly called the police, reporting the trespassers. By the time the officers arrived, the men were gone, but the evidence of their actions was clear. The trench had been widened, and additional steel beams had been left behind. Linda filed a report, knowing it was another piece of the puzzle she could use against Ray. The next day, Jennifer called with another update. "Linda, I've been digging into the property records, and I found something interesting. That easement Ray mentioned? It was dissolved over 20 years ago. He has no legal basis for his claim." Linda felt a surge of relief. "That's great news. Does this mean we can shut him down for good?" "It's a strong point in our favor," Jennifer said. "But don't get complacent. Ray's clearly willing to go to great lengths to get what he wants. We need to stay one step ahead." As Linda hung up, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Ray's campaign of intimidation and manipulation was unraveling, and she was determined to see it through to the end. This wasn't just a fight for her property. It was a fight to stand up against the kind of arrogance, entitlement that people like Ray thrived on, and she wasn't about to let him win. Linda's relief after Jennifer's discovery of the dissolved easement was short-lived. While it was a significant win on paper, it didn't stop Ray from escalating his tactics. By the end of the week, it was clear that he had no intention of backing down. The trenches in her backyard remained. The unfinished tracks lay like a taunt across her once beautiful lawn, and her neighbors had grown increasingly distant. The flyers Ray had distributed seemed to have done their job. Even the few people who had initially supported her now avoided her gaze when she walked down the street. The first sign of trouble that morning came when Linda stepped out onto her porch to grab the newspaper and saw another sign planted at the edge of her property. This one was larger and more aggressive than the last. Community Railway approved. Do not interfere. It wasn't just a sign. It was a blatant message to her and anyone passing by that Ray considered the fight over. Linda yanked the sign out of the ground, her hands shaking with anger, and threw it into her garage. She snapped a photo for Jennifer and then paced the length of her backyard, trying to calm herself. The tension only grew as the day wore on. Around noon, Linda noticed a group of people gathered at the far end of her property, just past the fence line. They weren't the usual construction workers. These men were dressed in dark professional clothing, holding clipboards and talking in low voices. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but one of them gestured toward her house, and another pointed at the trenches. Something about their demeanor set her on edge. Unable to ignore them, Linda approached the fence. "Can I help you?" she called out. The group turned toward her, their expressions unreadable. One of the men stepped forward, a tall figure with a sharp, businesslike air. Good afternoon, Ms. Wallace," he said smoothly. "We're here conducting a preliminary assessment on behalf of Mr. Gibson. He's requested a professional review of the site to ensure the project complies with safety standards." Linda's stomach turned. "What project? There's an injunction in place. Nothing is supposed to be happening here." The man smiled thinly. "We're not conducting construction, ma'am. This is a compliance review, which is permitted under the terms of the easement claim Mr. Gibson has filed. I assure you, we're operating within the boundaries of the law." Linda bristled. "That easement claim is bogus, and you know it. If you or anyone else sets foot on my property again, I'll have you removed for trespassing." The man's smile didn't falter, but there was a distinct edge to his tone as he replied, "We're simply doing our job, Ms. Wallace. I'd advise you to cooperate. It would make things much easier for everyone involved." Without waiting for her response, the man turned and rejoined his group. Linda stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he'd said them, the quiet threat underlying every syllable. She backed away from the fence and went straight inside to call Jennifer. They're sending people to assess my property now," Linda said as soon as Jennifer picked up. "They're claiming it's a compliance review for the easement." Jennifer sighed, the frustration clear in her voice. "They're trying to intimidate you. Legally, they're on shaky ground, but they're hoping you'll cave before we get to court. I'll draft another letter, but you need to document everything they're doing." Linda agreed and hung up, but the encounter had left her rattled. She spent the rest of the day double-checking her cameras and reviewing the footage from the previous night. To her dismay, she found more evidence of tampering. Someone had been on her property again, moving the steel beams and leaving fresh tire tracks near the trench. Whoever it was, they were careful to avoid being seen on camera, but the evidence of their activity was undeniable. That evening, Linda's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and chilling. "You're only making this harder for yourself. Stop now, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The anonymous threat confirmed what she had already suspected. This wasn't just about the railway. Someone was going out of their way to make her feel unsafe in her own home. Determined not to be cowed, Linda forwarded the message to Jennifer and then reported it to the police. The officer who took her statement was polite, but non-committal. "We'll file this as part of the ongoing harassment case," he said. "But unless there's a direct threat of violence, it's difficult to take further action." "Isn't this a direct threat?" Linda asked, her frustration mounting. The officer hesitated. It's vague enough that it could be interpreted differently. I understand this is upsetting, ma'am. But for now, the best course of action is to keep documenting everything. If this escalates, we'll have a stronger case. Linda thanked him through gritted teeth and hung up, feeling both angry and powerless. She hated the idea of waiting for something worse to happen before anyone would take action. The next morning, the situation escalated even further. Linda woke to find her backyard in chaos. Sometime during the night, someone had dumped a pile of construction debris into the trench. Broken beams, twisted metal, and even shards of concrete. It looked deliberate, a calculated act meant to provoke her. She took photos and sent them to Jennifer, who responded almost immediately. This is blatant harassment, Jennifer said. I'll include it in the case file, but you need to be prepared for them to deny involvement. People like Ray are experts at covering their tracks. Linda felt a fresh wave of anger. There are tire marks leading right to the trench. How can they deny that? They'll try, Jennifer said. But don't worry, we'll keep building our case. The more evidence we have, the better. Linda spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess, determined not to let Ray's antics derail her. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Sure enough, when she looked up, she saw Ray standing at the edge of his property, his arms crossed, and a smug grin on his face. Having fun, Linda? He called out. She ignored him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. But as she turned back to her work, she heard him mutter something under his breath. The words were too quiet to catch, but the mocking tone was unmistakable. That night, Linda decided she'd had enough. She reviewed all the footage from her cameras, meticulously piecing together the timeline of every intrusion and incident. Then she called Jennifer with a proposal. I want to file a restraining order against Ray, Linda said. He's not just trespassing. He's harassing me. This needs to stop. Jennifer agreed and promised to start the paperwork immediately. As Linda hung up, she felt a small flicker of hope. Ray might have pushed her to the brink, but she wasn't backing down. If he thought he could intimidate her into submission, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Linda sat in the courthouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as she waited for the hearing to begin. Jennifer sat beside her, calm and focused, flipping through the neatly organized case file. Across the room, Ray lounged in his chair with an air of smug confidence, flanked by his own attorney. The sight of him sitting so casually, as if this entire ordeal were just another game, made Linda's stomach twist with anger. But she pushed the emotion down, reminding herself that she had the truth and the evidence on her side. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with Jennifer presenting their case. She laid everything out in meticulous detail: the unauthorized construction on Linda's property, the baseless easement claim, the harassment, the threats, and the mounting evidence of Ray's deliberate attempts to intimidate Linda into submission. Jennifer's presentation was bolstered by the stack of photographs, videos, and documents Linda had painstakingly gathered over the past several weeks. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing over the evidence. When Jennifer presented the footage of the late-night trespassers and the dumped construction debris, the judge's expression darkened. This is not the behavior of someone acting in good faith, she remarked, her tone sharp. Mr. Gibson, do you have a response to these allegations? Ray's attorney stood, launching into a carefully rehearsed defense. He claimed that the railway project was for the benefit of the community, and that any work on Linda's property had been done with the belief that it was legally permitted under the easement. He dismissed the threats and harassment as misunderstandings and argued that Linda was overreacting to a simple neighborly dispute. Linda clenched her fists, barely able to contain her frustration as Ray's attorney painted her as unreasonable and combative. But Jennifer remained composed, waiting until the attorney finished before rising to rebut. With all due respect, Your Honor, Jennifer said, her voice steady. This is not a simple neighborly dispute. Mr. Gibson's actions have been calculated, aggressive, and entirely unjustified. The easement he claims to rely on was dissolved over 20 years ago, as confirmed by official property records. She held up the documents for emphasis. Furthermore, His repeated attempts to coerce my client into relinquishing her rights through threats, intimidation, and the defacement of her property are well documented. This is not about community benefit. This is about one man attempting to bully his way into control. The judge reviewed the documents Jennifer had submitted, nodding slowly. "Mr. Gibson," she said, turning her attention to Ray, "I find it highly concerning that you continued construction, despite the injunction, and that your workers trespassed on Ms. Wallace's property multiple times. Do you have any explanation for these actions?" Ray stood, adjusting his tie with exaggerated nonchalance. "Your Honor, I was under the impression that the injunction didn't apply to preparatory work. As for the trespassing, I can't control every single worker. Mistakes happen." The judge's eyes narrowed. "That excuse doesn't hold water, Mr. Gibson. You were explicitly ordered to cease all activity related to this project. Your blatant disregard for the court's order is unacceptable." Linda felt a flicker of satisfaction at the judge's stern tone, but she knew the hearing wasn't over yet. Ray's attorney attempted one final tactic, claiming that the railway was intended to serve as essential infrastructure for the neighborhood, and that halting the project would harm the community. He even presented a petition signed by several neighbors who supported the railway, hoping to sway the judge's opinion. Jennifer was ready. She stood and addressed the court, her voice firm. "Your Honor, while Mr. Gibson claims this project is for the community's benefit, it's clear from the evidence that his actions have been anything but altruistic. He has ignored legal boundaries, falsified permits, and manipulated his neighbors into supporting a project that violates my client's rights. This petition is irrelevant when weighed against the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct." The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she considered both sides. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Finally, she spoke. "Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Gibson has acted in bad faith and has shown a blatant disregard for the law. The injunction will be upheld, and I am ordering an immediate halt to all construction activity related to the railway project. Furthermore, Mr. Gibson is to remove all materials and repair the damage done to Ms. Wallace's property at his own expense." Linda exhaled, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. But the judge wasn't finished. "Additionally," she continued, "given the evidence of harassment and intimidation, I am granting Ms. Wallace's request for a restraining order against Mr. Gibson. Any further attempts to interfere with her property or her safety will result in severe legal consequences." Ray's smirk finally faltered. He looked at his attorney, who whispered something to him, but for once, he didn't have a clever remark or smug retort. Linda allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, knowing she had won. After the hearing, Jennifer turned to her with a rare grin. "That went about as well as it could have. He'll try to save face, but legally he's out of options. You did everything right, Linda." Linda nodded, relief washing over her. But as she left the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ray wasn't the type to give up easily. She had won this battle, but the war might not be over. For now, though, she allowed herself to savor the victory. Her yard, her home, and her peace of mind were finally hers again, at least for the moment. In the weeks following the court ruling, Linda finally began to feel a sense of normalcy returning to her life. The first step was overseeing the removal of the railway tracks and the restoration of her backyard. Per the court order, Ray was required to cover all the costs, and while he hadn't shown his face since the hearing, the team he hired worked under strict supervision from both Linda and Jennifer. Watching the workers dismantle the tracks felt like the final act of reclaiming her home. As the last of the debris was carted away, Linda walked the length of her yard, inspecting every corner to make sure nothing had been overlooked. The grass was still scarred, and her once thriving garden would take months to restore. But the sight of her yard, finally free from Ray's interference, filled her with relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could step outside without feeling like she was under siege. Jennifer had assured her that the restraining order would keep Ray in check, and so far, it seemed to be working. There were no more late-night intrusions, no signs planted on her property, and no more anonymous threats. Linda had installed additional security cameras around her home, just in case. But the footage remained uneventful. It was almost eerie how quiet things had become. Despite the peace, Linda couldn't ignore the lingering damage Ray's campaign had done to her reputation in the neighborhood. Many of her neighbors had been swayed by his lies, and the tension from the conflict hadn't completely dissipated. Some avoided her entirely, while others offered half-hearted apologies for supporting Ray. George, the neighbor who had warned her about the flyers, remained a steadfast ally, but the rest of the community seemed unsure of how to approach her. One evening, George stopped by with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Thought you could use a drink," he said with a grin. "I hear Ray's put his house up for sale." Linda raised an eyebrow, surprised. "He's leaving?" George nodded. "Looks like it. Guess he didn't want to stick around after losing so publicly?" "Can't say I'll miss him," Linda chuckled softly, pouring them each a glass. The thought of Ray leaving the neighborhood brought her more satisfaction than she cared to admit. It felt like the final piece of closure she needed. As they sat on the porch, George raised his glass in a toast. "To standing your ground," Linda smiled, clinking her glass against his. "And to never seeing another railroad in my yard again." In the following weeks, Linda threw herself into rebuilding her garden. She found solace in the simple act of planting flowers and vegetables, turning the soil back into something vibrant and alive. It was hard work, but it reminded her why she had fallen in love with the house in the first place. Slowly but surely, her yard began to feel like her sanctuary again. One Saturday, as Linda was planting a row of tomatoes, she heard a voice behind her. She turned to see one of her neighbors, a young woman named Claire, standing at the edge of the yard with a hesitant smile. "Hi, Linda," Claire said, shifting awkwardly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not standing up for you earlier. I should have known Ray was full of it." Linda wiped her hands on her jeans and gave Claire a small smile. "Thank you. That means a lot," Claire nodded, looking relieved. "If you ever need help with the garden or anything, just let me know." As Claire walked away, Linda felt a flicker of hope that her relationship with the neighborhood might eventually heal. It would take time, but she was willing to be patient. By the end of the summer, Linda's yard was unrecognizable from the wreckage Ray had left behind. The grass was lush and green again. Her flowers were in full bloom, and the garden beds were bursting with fresh produce. She threw a small barbecue to celebrate, inviting George, Claire, and a few other neighbors who had begun warming up to her. It was a modest gathering, but it felt like a fresh start. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Linda stood on her porch, looking out over her yard. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was a symbol of her resilience. She had fought for her home and her peace of mind, and she had won. The scars from the ordeal might never fully fade, but they were a reminder of her strength and determination. For the first time in months, Linda felt truly at ease. Her home was hers again, and she knew she wouldn't let anyone take it from her ever again.